to say hello to everybody. I know that we're all on different time zones, so for many of you this is the evening, but for some it is not, so hello. The paper I will present is co-authored with Wuyang Zhao. Wuyang is actually on the call, so maybe you'll see him there. And he and I are both graduates, PhD graduates of the University of Toronto's Rotman School. So we met up at a conference just about a year ago and started talking about this paper. It's a fairly new paper, and as you see, it's entitled Individual Analysts Non-GAAP Earnings Exclusions and Target Prices. All right, just trying to move forward. Sorry, getting stuck. There we go. So the research question is not unlike the title of the paper, and really what we're interested in is there an association between the non-GAAP earnings exclusions that some analysts make and the optimism of their target prices. And I say they're concurrently issued target prices. In other words, they're happening at the same time as the earnings forecasts being made. What I want to do right up front is give you an example from an analyst report. And as you can see, this is Deutsche Bank covering Avis Budget, the rental car company, with a buy recommendation. Right here, it shows that the target price or price target is $60 in the analyst report. And then down below, there are the earnings estimates or forecasts. And what I'll highlight for you is that there is both a GAAP, GPS, you might say, forecast, and an adjusted, or sometimes we say street earnings forecast, which we'll call an EPS forecast. Now, these are forecasts for year-end 15, year-end 2016. In year-end 2015, the analyst has a different forecast for GAAP and EPS. In other words, they've got that might be hard to see, $3.26 GAAP earnings forecast, $3.23 street earnings forecast. Okay, in other words, they've got exclusions in those 2015 forecasts. Now in 2016, another year out, they're actually the same, $3.72 forecasts. What we're going to do in this paper at a very basic level is really just tie together the price target, the target price, and any exclusion behavior, any activity where the analyst has different street and GAAP earnings forecasts. I'll go through some motivation and some prior literature related to both non-GAAP and target prices. As was said, I'm happy to take any questions along the way, but I'll just sort of start through this slowly and build up a little bit. So I guess it's fair to say quite a number of companies are reporting some kind of non-GAAP earnings, okay? In other words, the GAAP, as in generally accepted accounting principles, and non-GAAP earnings numbers actually continue to grow further and further apart, and more firms are making use of these non-GAAP metrics. Now, there are a couple of explanations in the literature as to why or how non-GAAP plays a role. And some would say that these non-GAAP metrics are more informative. For example, in the firm's cases, they may be suggesting that we overlook some of the less persistent earnings items that are sort of less relevant to the valuation of the firm. And that way, they might indeed end up with a better valuation, a more appropriate valuation of their firm by using non-GAAP. On the second point, though, some would argue that non-GAAP can be misleading. Frankly, quite often, non-GAAP metrics look better than GAAP earnings because expenses or losses have been removed, again, making the earnings look better. And that might be misleading in the sense that it could lead to higher than necessary valuations. So there really is literature that supports both these explanations. I'll talk a little bit about that literature on my next slide. Actually, my next slide. But what I want to say is that a lot of the literature in the non-GAAP space focuses on the properties of these earnings and does so at the firm level. Okay, so it says what are non-GAAP earnings, or what are the excluded items, the items taken out of GAAP earnings to come up with non-GAAP at the firm level. And indeed, what they tend to find is that non-GAAP earnings better predict future cash flows, or perhaps are more aligned with returns, suggesting that non-GAAP is really where the market is more focused, or should be more focused. Now, what we're doing is a little different in that we're focused on the analyst level, not on the firm level. And we sort of take the stance that analysts are important information intermediaries, important sort of users of financial information. At the same time, though, we know that analysts face incentives. There's plenty of literature about incentives that analysts face that might or often end up in them issuing fairly optimistic forecasts and recommendations and so on. But having said that, when we come back to exclusions in the non-GAAP space, exclusions being what's taken out of a GAAP forecast to come up with a street number, those exclusions actually tend to be higher quality than managers. In other words, managers can be a little bit more opportunistic than analysts in forming these non-GAAP metrics. So just building a little more on that opportunistic versus informative sort of debate, if you will. Early on the literature, and this is really sort of started up in 2002 with Bradshaw and Sloan, kind of a seminal piece in this space. Early on the literature said, well, actually what's getting excluded is all the bad stuff, the losses and the expenses, which again makes the non-GAAP metrics look higher or better. There was some talk of incentives early on. Lambert, 2004, an interesting discussion of a Gu and Chen paper, and basically said, you know, maybe there's incentives, which really got investigated in the big Farber-Petroni paper, okay? And that said that analysts make exclusions more so when they're more incentivized to come up with kind of higher or more opportunistic forecasts and valuations. Now, a little bit later in the research, and you can see these are more recent papers in terms of the dates, there was some thinking that exclusions by analysts actually result in higher quality earnings forecasts. So Barth, Gow, Taylor have a paper where they really focus on stock-based compensation expense. Do analysts include it or exclude it? Do managers include it or exclude it? And they said actually analysts tend to exclude it when it's less predictive of future earnings, when it makes sense to exclude it. Whipple, in his dissertation, which really started out a lot of this analyst-based exclusions literature, said actually the excluded items that analysts are taking out of their forecast tend to be non-cash, you know, seeming reasonable. And then again, here's Whipple's name again with Bentley et al. Had to say that, you know, analysts really are less aggressive than managers. So again, it's this sort of thinking that analysts might actually be doing the right thing when it comes to excluding earnings items from their street earnings forecasts. Okay, now the debate continues, not really settled. This is my own paper here. This is my co-author's paper here. So we're citing ourselves, but we will say in the Bratton, Larocque, and Yan paper that actually what analysts are excluding are persistent earnings items. And when I say persistent, I mean earnings that continue, you know, that are predictive of future earnings. So if something's persistent, why would you exclude it? You really shouldn't ignore it because it's going to continue in some way. In Wu Ying's paper with Mohanram and White, they said, well, analysts actually are excluding stock-based compensation quite a bit, and that affects their valuations. I'll touch a little bit on that later. So this is kind of focusing on the non-GAAP space. And I now want to talk a little bit about target prices because, of course, we sort of marry those two literatures, or we try to anyhow. So target prices do, we think, forecast, or pardon me, proxy for forecasted valuations. They certainly tend to affect stock prices in terms of when new target prices come out. Stock market reacts in the short term. That's shown in a couple of papers back in the early 2000s. At the same time, target prices are really quite optimistic. The Bradshaw, Brown, and Huang paper, I believe, said that something like only 39% of target prices are actually met over the next year. So they're quite optimistic. And that optimism provides a really nice setting to think about, well, what affects optimism? You know, why are target prices so optimistic? Which is certainly something that we're going to try and do. By the way, adjusting for optimism, or at least knowing about it, can help improve informativeness, which presumably can make investors better decisions in terms of what to invest in. So what we do is we try to, as I said, bring together those two strands of literature. Think about non-GAAP and think about target prices, focusing on individual analysts and when they make non-GAAP exclusions, how is that associated with the optimism of their target prices? Now, what's I think helpful, if not a little different here, is that we're going to investigate exclusions of both an EPS or earnings per share increasing and decreasing nature. In other words, we're going to look at when analysts exclude losses, we're going to look at when analysts exclude gains. We're going to look at those together and we're going to look at them separately because that will help us understand better the role of these exclusions. Now remember that earnings forecasts and the exclusions or not in those forecasts are really important in terms of an input into firm valuation. That's set out in Gu and Chen 2004 as well as elsewhere. So we go off and do a little side test in our appendix and just kind of prove to ourselves that in fact EPS or street earnings forecasts, those from which analysts may have removed things, are quite strongly related to target prices and even more so than their GAAP forecasts. It is really important to think about the street earnings per share forecast when thinking about forecasted valuations. I'll talk about predictions and then maybe I'll just stop and see if anyone has any questions along the way. We really make 3 predictions. Wu Yang and I thought a lot about these. Hopefully he's smiling as I say that. We started with a null prediction. We said, you know what, there could be analysts setting target prices and setting earnings forecasts and any exclusions that affect those, and doing those 2 things separately so that there's really no association between exclusions and target price optimism. And then we said, well, maybe this could just be mechanical. Maybe when analysts make EPS increasing exclusions, like they remove losses, maybe their target prices are higher. And vice versa, maybe when they make EPS decreasing exclusions, like they remove gains, maybe their target prices are lower. We don't know. There's a little bit of evidence in Wu Yang's paper, which is forthcoming in the review of accounting studies, which says when they remove stock compensation expense from their free cash flow and DCF valuations, that they're coming up with higher valuations. So that's one side of this when they make EPS increasing exclusions, but we really don't know overall, you know, is this mechanical or not? And then we thought, you know what? This could just be another way to be optimistic. This could be just another tool for analysts to sort of pull from their toolbox to form optimistic valuations. I think of a toolbox like when I have my hammer and screwdrivers and all those things that all those different pieces that go into the puzzle of them forming a valuation. So let me just stop there for a moment and I'll check, I guess if I look at the chat, I don't know if I can see the chat, but if anyone has any questions, please feel free to speak out and I'll just stop for a moment. Okay, perhaps I'll continue and maybe more questions will come later unless there's somebody who wants to stop.
I think Samira has a question, right?
Oh, thank you. I just can't see the, I can't see the faces and yeah, thank you.
Oh,
Go ahead, please.
That's fine, sorry. Just one clarification. When you're saying the GAAP numbers, you're talking about the GAAP numbers that the analysts are generating or the non-GAAP numbers? Okay, let me go back. So when you're saying non-GAAP numbers, are they the ones that the firms are reporting or the ones that the analysts are constructing, which we also say is street numbers?
Okay, good point. We are focusing on, like in this report example, the analyst forecasts of either GAAP or street earnings. We do a little bit later with managers' own non-GAAP usage, but really by and large what our data and our variables are focused on is the analyst's GAAP forecast, street forecast, and any difference from those two. Thank you for asking.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Great. I think I'll just jump back to where I was. So predictions. Let me talk just briefly about what we find. I like to sometimes preview the results so you don't have to wait till the end. Okay, so we're going to try and convince you that when analysts make these non-GAAP exclusions, in other words, when they have a different GAAP and street earnings forecast, that they tend to form more optimistic target prices. Now, what's quite interesting is that this seems to happen when both EPS increasing or EPS decreasing exclusions are made. Okay, which means this is not a mechanical relation. It's not that mechanical prediction that we thought might just be kind of an automatic, which frankly would be less interesting. It just seems like this is another tool, the use of exclusions, for analysts to come up with more optimistic target prices. We will talk a little bit about implications of this toolbox prediction. We'll talk about managers' own non-GAAP disclosures. Going back to the question that was asked, we'll touch a little bit on what managers are doing, and we'll look a little bit at other tools in the toolbox and whether they are coordinated together with the use of exclusions. Finally, we'll look a bit at market reactions to target prices. It's one thing to say target prices are optimistic or not, but it's another thing to say, does the market pay attention to that? And so we're going to try and look at both sides of that coin, if you will, and think about how the market reacts to target prices with exclusions. So I'll continue on with data. Again, if there are any questions at any time, let me know. You might have to just speak out because I can't really see the chat right now. We'll look at target prices with a 12-month horizon. Typically, target prices have a 12-month or 1-year horizon. And we will merge in forecasts by the same analyst made on the same day as the target price, those forecasts being for the upcoming fiscal year. Okay. Primarily what we do is we compare non-exclusion target prices, those where the GAAP and the street EPS forecasts are the same, with target prices with exclusions. Okay, and we do a little bit with the sort of extremes, just like prior literature. So going back to this picture again, this was, as it says in the top, an analyst report in early November 2015. Their price target, their target for 1 year out was $60, and we would focus on the upcoming year, as in the fiscal year 2015, which had not yet ended as of the date of the report. Again, the forecast for earnings and the target price being made on the same day by that very same analyst for the same firm. That's what we're bringing together. Just a very quick slide with lots of numbers on it about our sample distribution. But if you think of a sample of just over 400,000 observations, something like 60% of them have no exclusions, have an earnings forecast, EPS, equal to the GAAP GPS forecast, and then the other 40% do have exclusions. Now, of those, more of them are EPS increasing exclusions, okay, where EPS, street EPS, is larger than GAAP EPS, but some of them, in fact, are EPS decreasing. Analysts do remove gains, they remove tax items that actually result in decreases to street EPS. Okay, so quickly on samples distribution, and I'll move forward to some variables. I'll start with the earnings variables and then get into the target price variables. From an earnings or exclusion point of view, we're again comparing the GAAP forecast with the earnings per share, the street forecast, and looking at the difference. A lot of our tests are on what's called an indicator variable basis. Okay, so in other words, look, we don't spend as much time on the continuous value, the amount of the difference or of the exclusion, but so much on is there an exclusion or not? Exclude equals 1 or 0. Now, down at the bottom, I'll focus on the 3 measures of target price optimism that we use. The first one is, as it says, ex ante, ahead of time. We can see that they are optimistic, and the second 2 are, or the last 2 are ex post, as in we can see after the fact whether they were optimistic or not. So the first one, target price implied return, just says, you know, what's the estimated return from today based on current price and the target price. This is going to be increasing with optimism. The higher the expected or implied return, the more optimistic the target price is. Whereas the last 2 really compare the target price today with the price either in 12 months or over the next 12 months. So one says, well, how much was the error? This is target price forecast error, in the sense that what was the price in 12 months, again, ex post, compared to the target price that was predicted 12 months ago, versus target price met in percentage says, okay, relative to the target price over the next 12 months, on how many of those days did the closing price exceed the target price? Okay, so again, both these are decreasing with Optimism. And just remember that when we look at signs on our different tables. We take advantage as much as we can of match samples to the extent that we've got, of course, lots of different analysts, lots of different firms, and time, because our sample goes over quite a period of time. We've got differences there that we want to try to control for. So we'll have 3 different match samples where we're controlling for firm and date, analyst and date, and then analyst and firm, and even a little bit of date. I'll talk about that in a minute. So let's just go to the first one. We're going to compare target prices made by 2 different analysts for the same firm on the same date. In other words, they have the same information for the same firm, but they're just 2 different analysts. In the second point, the second type of sample, we'll compare the same analyst on the same day, but covering 2 different firms. And then in the third, which is probably the tightest match of all, we say, let's look at the same analyst on the same firm, but at different points in time, no more than 3 months apart. They make a target price forecast and some earnings forecasts, and then maybe a month later, which is on average in our sample what happens, they come up with something different. So let's look at that same analyst on the same firm within a short window. These 3 matches, these 3 sample matches will carry through on a few slides that I'll walk through soon. Let me just stop and see if there are any questions before I jump into some tables. And again, you're just going to have to speak out because I can't see the chat.
I have a quick question here.
Thank you.
Based on my understanding, what you're doing is looking at the changes in the analyst, how they exclude and what exactly they exclude based on the GAAP versus non-GAAP. Is your sample is only through normal business time? Because usually we have some of the times where you have crisis happening in the market or some industry shock, something like this. This will affect the ability of the manager to provide guidance, in addition to the ability of the analyst to provide their opinion to the investor to make their purchase decision. So are you considering the difference in time, or are you just talking about the normal periods?
Okay, that's a very good question, because of course there are real differences across time. Let me just show you the sample period we cover, which starts in 2003, and that's really about the earliest you can go in IBIS, which is the data provider, the provider of IBIS, or rather analyst forecasts. But the earliest you can go to get a really good sort of sample of both earnings, street earnings, and GAAP earnings forecasts. So we go from 2003 to 2017. Obviously, we don't have 2020 in there, but of course, we've got the ups and downs of the financial crisis in the sort of 08, 09, even 07 period. Yeah, so we do cover a range of dates, and just moving ahead a second here, we are, as I mentioned, in the match samples as much as possible trying to control for date, in the sense that we're comparing, okay, given whatever period in the business cycle we are in, let's look at the same firm on the same day, or let's look at the same analyst on the same day. So we're, and even, within 3-month windows. So we're doing as much as we can to control for, or to take account of timing. I'd say also in our regression analysis, which I haven't got it into yet, but I'll kind of come back to it when we get there, we do have fixed effects that will take into account that as well. Does that answer your question, sir?
Kind of. The question mainly, did you split your sample based on that particular period compared to the regular time? Because I'm expecting that the analyst behavior would be different during turbulent time compared to the time that everything is normal and we just giving an opinion to the investors. But if, investor attention would be different during that time as well.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing we could do is go back and say, well, what if we only focused on sort of 07, 08, 09? Or what if we took out 07, 08, 09, where I would think that you'd have the most, you know, differences, if you will, and most uncertainty anyhow. We could certainly look into doing something along those lines because we haven't done much of that yet. Thank you for the suggestion.
No problem.
Okay, I'm going to assume there's no other questions. Just keep going. We talked about match samples, so I will now show you descriptive statistics, which have these pretty strong matching. And what I'm going to do, just as it says in the top here, is compare a target price with exclusion, as in with a different GAAP and street EPS forecast, to a non-exclusion target price, one where the street and GAAP EPS forecasts are the same. Okay, I've got 3 panels in table 2, and the first one is matched by firm and date, and it says let's compare each of these 3 target price metrics: target price implied return, target price forecast error, and the percent of days met across, again, non-exclusion and exclusion target prices. Okay, target price implied returns, if we can start there, the ex-ante measure, are significantly higher or target prices with exclusions. For example, mean 0.128 or 12.8% versus mean 0.124. Okay, now remember that these ex post measures go the opposite direction. So the target price errors are worse, which is to say they're more optimistic for those target prices with exclusions versus non-exclusions. And my numbers here in the middle are mean negative 0.055 with exclusions versus negative 0.043 without exclusions. Okay, and again, significant differences in this one. This one isn't quite statistically significant, although I'll show you in other matchings, we do have some fairly strong results. So 3 panels, this is matched by firm and date. This is matched by analyst and date. You can see my differences are all statistically significant and quite strong. And then this last one is matched by analyst and firm, the same analyst on the same firm within 90 days. And again, these are quite strong results. Okay, so preliminary results suggest, all right, there is some kind of association between the use of exclusions, between removing something from your street forecasts, and the optimism of a target price by the same analyst. What we want to do next is say, let's now look at the direction of the exclusion, as in, is it EPS increasing because they've removed losses, or is it EPS decreasing because they've removed gains? I'm going to do the same kind of matching, just like we talked about before, except now we're matching a target price with either an EPS increasing exclusion to a non-exclusion target price, or target price with an EPS decreasing exclusion to a non-exclusion target price. That's a lot of words, but I mean, essentially, as you'll see in the next few panels, we're going to look at direction separately. Okay, let me go ahead and do that. This is the first set, and again, in the order that we did before, the sample matched by firm and date. Okay, so same firm on the same date has a target price, but by 2 different analysts. And there are some cases where the results are quite strong and significant. Okay, as you can see, for example, the median implied return for an EPS increasing exclusion is bigger than that for a target price without exclusion. I'll go over here. Maybe actually I'll go down to the bottom. Very bottom. Target price percent met. Okay, the percentage of days over the next year when the target price is met is lower and significantly lower when there's an EPS decreasing exclusion versus when the target price has no exclusions associated with it. Now, I could just keep going and show you the same kind of thing and the same kind of thing with different matching. I think really the takeaway from these 3 sets, or 3 sets of 2 panels each, is that based on the 3 different types of matching, we get pretty solid, strong results, okay? Whether the exclusion made by the analyst is of an EPS increasing or an EPS decreasing nature, they still seem to be more optimistic in their target prices. And I'll come back to the predictions in a moment, just talk a little bit about regressions. You know, some people will look at match samples and say, you've done a great job, you know, you've matched as much as you can. I'm satisfied, but there's always going to be people out there that want to see regressions, and maybe some of you are them too. So we try to satisfy that audience as well and say, let's just look at the target price measure regressed on this exclude variable.
So here's Mohammed again. I'm just curious to know, what is the intuition behind that they are optimistic in both cases when they have, you know, a decreasing versus an increasing EPS? So in both cases, are they reporting the investor to the same direction no matter how the company is behaving? Am I understanding this correctly?
It's a way of thinking of it. We come back to these predictions, and you know, to your point, it's not mechanical in that it's going in the same direction as the exclusions. You know, that the EPS increasing exclusions have higher target prices, the EPS decreasing have lower target prices. In fact, it seems either type of exclusion is resulting or is associated with higher target price optimism. So to your question, what's the explanation? We believe this suggests that analysts use exclusions, perhaps opportunistically, but that they use them to help build a case for a higher target price optimism. Now, I'm going to have to show you a bit later that an EPS decreasing exclusion doesn't, of course, naturally get you to a higher target price. They end up tweaking or changing, if you will, their growth forecasts and their valuation multiples so that together these 3 tools end up in a higher target price. Does that help? Or answer your question?
The question comes back again. I don't see the clear point why they're making optimism decisions all the time, even in both cases. But did you look at the relationship between the analyst and the company?
Yeah, so we've thought a bit about what are often referred to as incentives. We had a little bit more about incentives in the paper until recently, but really, I think what we do say, and what is, I think, fair to say from the analyst literature, is that overwhelmingly there are incentives for analysts to be optimistic. Okay, now why? Because they want to talk to managers about the firm, and they want to make the managers happier by having more optimistic target prices, and the manager thinks, great, my stock options are going to be worth great. You're positive on this stock, on this firm, I'm more willing to share information with you. As well as to, you know, create trading volume business in their own brokerages. The analysts, you know, want to get people buying the stock, and therefore having more optimistic valuations can help with that. I talked a little in an earlier slide about why target prices. If you think about analysts, they issue short-term earnings forecasts, long-term earnings forecasts, target prices recommendations. One of the places, particularly in more recent years, one of the places where you can see the most kind of optimism or the most variation in optimism is in target prices. So that's kind of why we went here, which is a way of saying analysts tend to be optimistic. They especially tend to be optimistic in their target prices. And how do they get there? Well, it seems to be through a function of the inputs in their fundamental valuation models, including the earnings forecasts, which are affected by the exclusions.
Thanks for the answer. I don't want to dictate the conversation here, but you know, isn't that, and again, I'm not sure if you looked at this or not, but isn't that going to affect the reputation of the analyst after some time? How is that going to be, you know, perceived by, you know, the investors? Because you can deceive me one time or two, but you will not be able to deceive me along the whole way, right?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And we don't quite hit on the reputation of the analyst, but we do get to the market reaction to the target price changes, which is obviously a step away from analyst reputation, but it is a way of saying, how does the market measure this? Do they do they buy it wholesale? Did they see through the optimism related to exclusions, or are they okay with it? In fact, we find some interesting variation. They don't tend to like the EPS decreasing exclusion relation with target prices, or another way of saying that is they don't tend to react as much to target prices with EPS decreasing exclusions. So that, again, isn't quite reputation, but it is a measure of how investors are reacting to analysts' target prices. There might be some other questions. If there are, please speak out because I cannot always see the chat. Thank you.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Yeah, Jim Olson here. My concern is that, are you looking at sales forecasts rather than earnings forecasts? And the second thing is that the thing that's missing in the discussion is something about EPS2 forecast. You're looking at EPS1 forecast, right?
I agree.
Why
yes,
are you
correct.
not looking at EPS2 forecast? And what you have to keep in mind, that changes in EPS forecast, they have an impact upon growth forecast. And the word that's missing in your discussion is growth. In other words, sales growth, earnings growth, those are the driving factors in the market. It is not changes in EPS1, forward earnings. That's very minor background noise. The big picture is what's going to be the growth and what about the top line growth.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
Are you introducing that at all?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. So I'll start with growth. Absolutely. We will show you some analyses that we get into that says what happens, or sort of concurrently, what are their growth forecasts doing when they are or aren't making exclusions. So yes, we will touch on that growth, and that will be a function, that growth, Jim, of EPS2 over EPS1. So we're going to take a look at sort of the next year's growth, okay? Sales did not come into our analysis, and I'd be interested to hear any suggestions you'd have there, in the sense that when we focus on exclusions, we focus on what affects the bottom line, and what tends to be, of course, expense, loss, and gain exclusions. I don't know of many exclusions to sales, although that's not to say they don't happen ever. But if you have any suggestions in that regard, I'd be interested to hear.
Yeah, my comment is only that in the marketplace, if you want to make the case about the target price, what they focus on is sales and sales growth. That's the top line. And if you want to have a strong buy, it's very difficult to make the case, oh, this stock is underpriced, unless you have something to say about sales.
Okay. It's an interesting point because to my knowledge in the target price literature, and if someone else there wants to correct me, please do. To my knowledge in the target price literature, there's not a lot that ties sales growth into target price. They tend to focus on earnings. That's an interesting point.
That's correct, yes, but that's not the real world.
Fair enough, but it suggests that it's an area for research, whether we have to bring it into this paper or there's more to be done with that. It's a great point, thank you.
Stephanie, I had a quick question.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so this is Allison. So I've never worked with the target price data, so forgive the ignorance of this question. But I guess I would have thought that perhaps your prediction number 2 would actually have been called your Toolbox Prediction. Because if I want to make a higher target price and I want to justify this, I would make an exclusion to the gap number. I'd make an exclusion that would support that higher price. So that the mechanical piece sounds kind of like a toolbox to me also. I didn't know how you would, I don't have a good suggestion for how you would disentangle them empirically, but I guess I thought that number 2 sounded an awful lot like a tool to me as well. And you rule that out because of your results, increasing and decreasing, you find support for that. But I guess I didn't know how that was mechanical versus toolbox.
Okay, that's a great point. I'm going to get to that in a few slides. So if you can bear with me, I'll get to kind of more about the Toolbox Prediction and what will be related to that, such as Jim Olson's point about growth. Then maybe it will become more clear. And if you have more questions at that time, please do jump in. Okay.
I think that would help with that is maybe talking about the production function of the analyst. and
Okay.
what comes first, right? So if it's a price target and I need to support it by the earnings number, or the earnings target, then I create my price. And maybe you get to that, and I apologize, hopefully.
Yeah, we do have a bit of that in the paper, and I mean it's certainly a question mark. You know, do analysts properly sit down? Jim's going to say, no, that's not the real world. But do they properly sit down, make an earnings forecast, come up with growth, come up with a proper discount rate, and then come up with a target price? Or do they say, this is my target price, and I'm going to do whatever I have to justify it? Chances are we're more in the second place. We do talk a bit about that in the paper, but I haven't really brought it into my presentation, so point taken. That would have been helpful. I'm glad you brought it up. Okay, I think I'll just jump into the regression analysis, and then we'll have a chance to talk more about the toolbox, which I think seems to be where there's some interest. So briefly, that regression analysis is going to say the target price measure regressed on either the exclude indicator, or I might look at exclude EPS increasing versus decreasing as an indicator with a whole lot of controls. So we're trying to control for some of the same sorts of things: firm level, analyst characteristics, and as we spoke about earlier, one of the first questions, time, when we do this kind of regression. Okay, the upshot is, and again, remember, the first of the three measures, we are going to see higher is more optimistic. The second and third ones, lower is more optimistic. But the upshot is that there is this significant relation in terms of exclusions being associated with greater target price optimism. Okay, and again, that's true for all exclusions in our sample, as well as for each of EPS increasing and EPS decreasing exclusions in our sample.
One could, however, make the point that given that you have close to 400,000 observations, the t-statistics are extremely marginal, to put it mildly.
Okay.
In other words, many people would say, given the n, 400,000, and given a t-statistic of 4, that's nothing.
Yeah.
What you could do is to try to do something like Farmer-Macbeth. In other words, you could do sample splitting, because right now what you have is nothing convincing whatsoever. No, I mean, it's up to you. All I'm saying is suppose this is 400, it's 400,000.
Yeah.
That's a very large N. And if you can't get, it's guaranteed that you will get the t-statistic, which is greater than 2. And you have 4. So what I'm saying is it's lurking in the background. Now, there are many things you can do to persuade people that if I use this kind of a data analysis, like Farmer-Macbeth or whatever have you, then you could show it actually works for every year.
Yeah, you know, that's a very interesting point. And Jim, I was
But
on
then
a workshop.
the results will not hold up. That's what this tells you. In other words, if you try to do something robust, I can bet with you that it's not, you're going to have to accept the null.
Okay, so we are willing to work with Farmer-Macbeth regressions. In fact, I was on the workshop not that many months ago where you spoke of how accounting has really moved away from Farmer-Macbeth. So absolute point taken, and we can go and look at that. We are also doing this match sample analyses, which is obviously smaller sample and tighter matches, where we've got some pretty strong results. But point taken about Farmer-Macbeth, we're willing to look. I'm sorry?
No, it's okay. That's a different story. The problems with that approach is you could do that much more non-parametrically. Just go through much more strict counting exercises. In other words, the case has learned in the background is that if you did different kinds of data analysis, it would become simpler, more straightforward. It would also become more persuasive if the effects are really present.
Okay. Okay. Now, we have done a number of robustness checks, but again, we have not done Farmer-Macbeth, and we are willing to have a look at that. That's absolutely a criticism that we're willing to look into. Thank you. All right. Let me jump back into the toolbox analysis, or prediction rather. Okay, so I talked a little bit about this and why or how we ruled them out. Let me talk more about the Toolbox Prediction itself. Again, when we say that exclusions are a tool, I know I've kind of mentioned this earlier, so if you bear with me, we think of analysts as incentivized to set optimistic valuations and having several ways or tools by which they can do so, which is the underlying earnings forecast themselves, their forecast of long-term growth, their discount rates, which of course in turn affect their valuation multiples, and the exclusions, going back to the first thing, the earnings forecasts are something or a tool by which they could produce possibly a higher or a more optimistic target price. So we think about these tools, I've kind of just said this first point, and implications of them. One being whether they might have, in some situations, more or less discretion or sort of, if you want to say, desire or willingness to go out and use exclusions. And then second, looking into these various tools and whether they get coordinated by the analyst, whether they are in sort of tandem using exclusions or not, playing with their growth forecast, that was the point first brought up by Jim, and for that matter, with their price to earnings multiples. Okay, so that's kind of the last point I'm making here. The middle one, which we really haven't touched on, is, well, what are the firms doing? Actually, the first question was about were we looking at what the firms are doing, or at least how are we measuring GAAP and EPS forecasts? We're going to take into account in this second point what the firms are doing, because we know well, we know from survey-based evidence that analysts claim to do often what the firm is doing in terms of using non-GAAP or making exclusions. And we know from some empirical literature that there's certainly an association between analysts' use of exclusions and firms' uses of exclusions. Okay, so back to the point of discretion. Because we think that analysts, or we have seen in prior literature that analysts tend to follow what the firm does, it would seem that when the firm is using non-GAAP exclusions, the analyst is probably more likely to do it. When the firm is not, the analyst has a little more discretion. They can kind of do what they want, or they might think that they can do what they want. Okay, so we look at it from the point of view of what's manager's role? Do they sort of guide analyst exclusions, and does that affect this relation that we think we see between non-GAAP exclusions and target price optimism? Let me talk a little bit more about this. Actually, I think I've kind of touched on some of this, firm behavior playing a role. Maybe just speak to the literature. So the Brown, Call, Clement, Sharp, much cited paper is a survey paper of analysts, and they've got all kinds of great data in there in terms of what analysts report that they do based on surveys. And then even some earlier research which suggests that analysts tend to follow management's guidance or sort of prodding, as in, we really think that you should remove stock compensation expense. Okay, let's do it. Think of it sort of as a game being played that way. Now, having said that, analysts do tend to follow management's exclusions, but not always. Okay, and in a paper I've got with Brian Bratton and Terry Yan, we show that on the same firm, looking at all the different analysts following the firm, they're not all doing the same thing. There is variation across analysts in whether they are making exclusions or not, in the same way that we measure it in this target price paper, okay? Different analysts are doing different things, and that's something we're able to take advantage of in some of the match sample designs. Now, Allison, I'm hoping that this has touched on this last slide and this one. Some of what you've asked me about the toolbox. I'll also get into the use of growth and valuation multiples in a moment. So let me just stick with management's use of non-GAAP disclosures. Now, what we do is we have a variable manager exclusion, which is basically an indicator variable that says, did the firm, as it says on the screen, report non-GAAP earnings in at least a quarter of the same year for which the analyst is forecasting? Okay, so we try to be careful about saying in the same year that the analyst is making the forecast. Is management kind of suggesting or making any kind of exclusions itself? What we're interested in is this interaction. Okay, remember our main results said, okay, is the target price measure associated with the use of exclusions. And here we're going to layer in, and how about the manager's use of exclusions? So, lots on the screen there. Again, the exclude variable, just like in our main results, was associated with the optimism in the right directions here of each of these ways of measuring target price optimism, okay? Now, what we're interested in is, do the manager's exclusions kind of reduce or result in less of an association between target price optimism and analysts' exclusions? And it does seem that managers' exclusions sort of rein in, or as I said, reduce some of that relation between exclusions and target price optimism. That's the first three columns. Now there's a lot more in the columns 4, 5, and 6, and that's where we start to look at sign. Are the exclusions of an EPS increasing or decreasing nature, just like we did before? And then, by the way, are the manager's exclusions of an EPS increasing or decreasing nature? Okay, all of that to say that indeed managers' exclusions do seem to dampen, maybe not fully reduce, but dampen much of the relation between exclusions, either EPS increasing or decreasing, much of that relation with target price optimism.
Dear Prof,
Yeah.
there is some questions.
Okay.
Yeah, Dr. Hassan Abdu, you can ask.
Thank you.
Yes, hi. I was just wondering, thanks, Stephanie. I just wondered, relative to Jim's point about revenue forecasts, whether you observe many or any differences in the measurement of revenue between GAAP and non-GAAP. You know, to what extent do analysts have discretion in revenue measurement when they're excluding, say, non-cash items? I suspect some of the differences in earnings might be excluding financing items. They probably have a less discretion, I guess, with the revenue.
Are you asking me?
Stephanie, or well, either of you. I'm curious.
How about I'll answer what I know, and then Jim,
yeah,
feel free to add to me.
Based
on the data we have from IBIS, which is really kind of the, I don't want to say a preeminent, but most popular forecast data provider, it's really hard to get a handle on what's in the sales forecast. You might see a sales forecast. I think increasingly in recent years, we'll see a sales forecast for an analyst.
Yeah.
But there's not a non-GAAP sales forecast given.
Right.
So it really isn't easy to disentangle that without going to some hand-collected sample analysis, which again, I have yet to see anyone do that in the target space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So IBIS, so there's no such thing as a non-GAAP or street revenue number. It's just revenue, which is what was the gap.
Correct. Yeah. To my knowledge, in IBIS, the only place you'll see a non-GAAP forecast is with respect to bottom line earnings.
The earnings.
Okay.
Thanks.
GAAP or non-GAAP, in other words. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I think there are certain industries that do report non-GAAP revenue, adjusted revenues as well, but they're not that common. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, the problem is that it's not available. The problem from an analyst research point of view is that it's not available in IBIS, but it would be very interesting to look at. Because
I think
no doubt
it's mostly,
yeah.
Yeah, you could get that through hand collecting, but yeah, you're right. Getting it through the analyst space is different.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm willing to believe, I'm a former analyst, by the way. I spent 8 years at UBS as a financial analyst. Don't hold that against me. But I'm willing to believe that if there are industries where the firms, as you suggest, are reporting non-GAAP sales, that the analysts might also do the same. But again, we just don't have the data to observe it without going to hand collection. So that's a project for someone out there, maybe yourself or someone on the call.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A question, Dr. Hussein Abdu.
Okay.
You can open your mic.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, sorry. Thanks, Mohammed. It's just going back to that lower end observation. I might suggest using different statistical modeling technique. Something from the genetic programming family might might help in sorting out all the regression problems actually. Throughout my experience working with regression, I think non-parametric modeling techniques would be in a position to sort out all the trouble around the regression family. It's only a suggestion. I'm not sure what's outcomes, but we never know. Thank you.
I would be interested, I'm sure my co-author too would be interested in that, that sort of background. If you're willing to send me even just a snippet of something you're referring to, because that sounds like
Absolutely.
a space I'm not too familiar with, I'd much appreciate it.
Will do. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Okay,
Thanks.
super.
I have a quick question.
Thank you, yes.
I just wonder, why do you use industry effects rather than firm effects?
Yeah,
I'm just curious.
The thing with the firm effect is, do we throw the baby out with the bathwater, as they say? We want to capture with an industry fixed effect commonalities across industries in terms of where you might have items that are more or less persistent and therefore might be excluded, but we didn't want to get all the way to the firm level and just sort of eliminate that for, you know, sort of all that firm, for every analyst covering that firm by having a firm fixed effect.
Yeah, I'm just curious.
That's top of mind what's coming to me. Now, I will say that we do in robustness include firm fixed effects, and as you would expect, the results get weaker. I think for that same reason that we think, you know, this is in some ways a firm, what other word can we use? Effect, whether there is stock comp expense or not, whether there is a one-time gain or not. It's a, yeah. So if we took that out completely for all the analysts covering that firm, we wouldn't have much left, which would be a problem.
Yeah, it would be, yeah.
Yeah. So we do talk, Jim, about that in the paper a little bit, but we could probably make more of why we include industry fixed effects and yeah, okay.
I'm just curious.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thanks so much. I am quite sure my co-author, Wu Yang, is taking notes while I talk away, so I'm going to be glad to have a look at all this when we sit down later. Thank you. Okay, so we talked about management's non-GAAP disclosures, and let's kind of get back here into what else is in the toolbox. Okay, so there are different, as I mentioned, tools that analysts can use. Growth, and we're going to focus on that year 2 versus year 1 growth implied from their forecasts, and for that matter, valuations, which are a function of growth and discount rates, of course. So growth might be forecast differently, as it says on my slide, for a number of reasons. Okay, it could be that the excluded items have implications for future growth. We sell something, there's a gain that affects future growth in some way. It could be that there's some mechanical distortion. Okay, and if you think about growth being, you know, next year over this year, if this year is suddenly made higher or lower as a relative exclusions, that's sort of mechanical in the sense that growth looks distorted, or maybe the analyst forgets to adjust for that. Or there could be some kind of persistence perception, difference in that's hard to say, difference in persistence that is perceived by analysts in terms of excluded items. And we often think about exclusions as being of more transitory, in other words, less persistent items that could factor in or play a role into the growth being forecast. So again, I'll look at both growth forecasts and I say earnings to price multiples here. Really, we went with the, I want to say, Liu, Nissim, and Thomas paper that says don't look at price to earnings because P to E tends to be small and you get this small denominator effect. So instead look at E to P. Okay, just the reverse.
Hi,
all right.
Stephannie.
Yeah, please.
Hi, can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
This is a follow-up to the earlier question Alison was raising. So basically she was saying, well, it's kind of hard to differentiate between mechanical versus toolbox, right? So here you are trying to get to the toolbox, but what I noticed is that the tools that you're looking at, growth and EP ratio, they're both linked to earnings forecasts. So that makes it kind of hard to, again, tease out the two explanations.
Yeah.
One thought I had was, Jim was saying earlier, maybe you can look at top line growth. What if you look at the growth measured using sales instead of earnings.
I see. So if I just go to my
Yeah.
table, I've got EPS growth, which is of course associated with the denominator includes or doesn't include an exclusion. What if I look at sales growth as well? That's a good suggestion.
Now,
Yeah,
PE ratio, though, I don't know what you can do about
It's
that.
hard to get around that, isn't it? Yeah, go ahead.
No, but you use forward EP. It really should be EPS 2P. And the question at hand is, again, you probably know this as well as everybody else, but what's lurking in the background is that the issue when it comes to earnings forecasting is that they like to show growth. Firms like to show growth, analysts like to show growth. Then it feeds back into the investment community. And what they do is to compare with how much of this is due to the margins. In other words, everything else constant. Earnings growth without corroboration in sales growth looks dubious. So what you could try to do is to check up if they use part of a toolbox is that maybe they're trying to jack up the growth in earnings and to motivate the high target price. So you then go to the sales growth. Somewhere along the line, the sales growth becomes very important because that's, of course, a primary driver of value and target prices. And when it comes to the asymmetry, in other words, if you want to explain EP multiples, the best way to do that is not earnings growth, it's sales growth. Forecasted sales growth. Sales 2 years down the line versus sales 1 year down the line, upcoming year.
Yeah.
But again, it's very easy to come up with all of these suggestions. So the question, in some sense, you probably want to have a fairly concrete story. What is it that the analysts are trying to accomplish playing around with these exclusion and items?
Yeah.
One thing that you could also hypothesize is that they're just trying to signal that they're very diligent, they know what they're doing. So therefore, I'm going to show that I can do these things correctly. So there are many, many things that go on, but it would be interesting to nail it down as to sort of like if you interviewed some of these people and you ask them, why are you doing this? What do you think their answers would be?
Yeah, survey evidence from Brown et al. Says we're doing what the firm says we should do, or we're following the firm. But it would be interesting, maybe the question wasn't asked that way in that survey. You know, are you trying to make yourself look like a better analyst? Yeah. Oh, these are all great suggestions. Really appreciate it, because again, we have not thought about sales at all. Yeah. I mean, we thought about it, but we certainly didn't build it in our test.
It's not the idea that you exclude or include items from sales.
Yeah.
It is much more that when you think about target prices and how they come up with target prices, they are primarily motivated by optimism in sales.
Sure. Sure. I mean, it would make sense that.
Sorry. Yeah, I shall be quiet. Sorry.
Oh, no. This has been helpful. It would make sense that more sales growth means more earnings. More earnings growth means higher valuation. And there might be a breakdown in some cases in terms of not enough sales growth, but a lot of action in earnings, perhaps as a result of the exclusion. So that's something we can look into. I can't say what will happen without us having done the analysis, but we'll certainly have a look. Thank you so much. Okay, I think when I got to this table, I didn't quite sort of talk through the results. So it looks like I can go ahead and do that. It doesn't seem that anyone's asking a question right now. We do note, and I'll start with the EPS increasing exclusions and then move to the EPS decreasing. Okay, we do note for EPS increasing exclusions that EPS growth, this is year 2 over year 1, seems to be lower, actually significantly lower in a matched sample. Okay.
Yeah. You get outliers in that one.
True. Now we do have both mean and median. Yeah, no, fair enough. And that's why we look at both means and medians, but fair enough. Yep. And I know we do a little bit of winds rising, but I think the median analysis may be a good way to get around those outliers here. What else? And then we look at the valuation multiples. And I'm, again, just going to stick with EPS increasing exclusions. Those E to P multiples, again, we're in reverse or inverse, earnings to price, are just a bit higher, which is to say PE higher, which is to say PE is a little bit lower. Now, put this all together. If you go back to the earlier analysis, you've got your exclusions, you've got your earnings growth, you've got your, which is lower, you've got your P to E, which is lower, or E to P is higher. It still ends up, when you put it all together, with a more optimistic target price, okay? Now let's move to EPS decreasing, because that's a little bit different, as the word was said, asymmetric. So we've got EPS decreasing exclusions. We're taking out gains, for example. That is associated with, that is in our match sample, seeming to result in higher EPS growth forecasts. Again, year 2 over year 1. And we don't have it in this table, but additional analysis says that it's not, it doesn't make sense. In other words, if you look at actual ex post realized growth, they are far too optimistic when they're making EPS decreasing exclusions.
That's a measurement problem, yeah.
A measurement
I mean, you have
problem.
to, the key thing is that everything is going to be, when you deal with realization, you've got to start to deal with losses.
Yeah.
And that sort of means that you have to reconfigure the whole thing in terms of when you talk about realized growth. And that's why often people focus on sales growth, because sales growth is a very clean variable. And realized sales can be compared to ex ante, the forecasted sales growth. So that's sort of a much more natural thing. When you look at EPS growth, it's very problematic with the denominator no matter what.
Okay, I take your point.
Yeah, and so it's just a matter of sorting this thing out.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, we did go ahead and take out loss firms to be sure, and our results held up, but I take your point. Looking at sales is going to be even cleaner because we don't have the small denominator or the negative denominator issue, or, yeah, okay. It's a little bit more removed, but it's than earnings, but yeah.
Well, if I may say something else, that the direction you may go into is really to focus on expense growth. And because that's where really where the exclusions are taken down. So what you really want to shift the analysis is not to this profit margins and per share analysis of that kind is very difficult to deal with. So the question at hand is that when you have exclusions, what impact does that have on the bias in expense growth?
Yeah.
Because then you get the complete loop. What you did, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. Sales minus expenses equals earnings. Yes, of course. Disaggregate and understand better.
Expense growth is a very good variable, which is not dealt with in the literature.
Yeah.
Again, I should be quiet. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm quite interested in disaggregated forecasts. I've got a paper on tax forecasts, and I'm certainly working on some projects on disaggregated forecasts. You're making me think about that and not just about the project at hand. But okay, thank you so much. I'll keep my tangent to myself. Okay, I think down here we were talking about EPS decreasing exclusions, which are the surprising ones, of course, because they're ending up in more optimistic target prices. So first of all, their growth forecasts, those EPS decreasing exclusion analysts or target prices, their growth forecasts are significantly higher, particularly on the mean, and their earnings to price multiples are lower, which is like saying their PE multiples higher because we're doing the inverse. And when you put them all together, again, EPS decreasing exclusions are associated with higher target prices, more optimistic target prices. And that comes back to the toolbox where they're, making exclusion, but also seemingly adjusting this, probably too much so based on ex post growth, and adjusting the multiple as well that helps them get to their target price. Okay, I'll kind of get into target price informativeness now. I think I talked a little bit about the two sides of the coin. So sometimes in the analyst literature, they'll say, you know, how optimistic or how accurate are the forecasts being made? And then people will say, yeah, but what about the market? Does the market get it? Do they react to this? Do they see through it? So in the target price space, we look at the informativeness of a target price following Brav and Laheyvi back in 2003. And really what they say is, let's regress returns, buy and hold returns, adjusted returns, on a target price revision. Okay, so we're not looking at the level of the target price, but the change in the target price, because literature says that the market will respond to changes, if you want to think of it that way. All right, when there's a target price revision and there's an exclusion over here, is there any difference in the degree to which the market responds? That's really what we're questioning here or asking. Now, like Brav and Laheyvi, we're going to control for other things that happen, like changes in earnings forecast, like upgrades or downgrades or iterations of recommendations, and then some other effects and controls that are in the model. And that's there. Maybe start at the top. Change in target price. Now, we look at buy and hold returns over 3 days and over approximately a 1-year window. And indeed, there's a positive association between those returns, either 3-day or 1 year, and the change in the target price. Okay, so that's consistent with prior literature. But what we'll do next is say, is there any incremental or any difference in the amount the market that reacts to the target price revision when there's exclusions? Okay, in the short term, yes. In the 3-day window, buy and hold admirable returns, -1 to +1, there is more reaction, even more reaction, you might say, to a change in the target price. Now over here in columns 3 and 4, we're going to say, let's break that down into, was that exclusion, just like before, in EPS increasing or EPS decreasing, excluding losses, excluding gains. Okay, and in the case of EPS increasing, we're still seeing more reaction per change in target price, but actually for the EPS decreasing, the one that's a little bit more surprising, you might say, where they're tweaking their growth forecasts to get there, these EPS decreasing exclusions are actually associated with less market reaction per change in target price. So that, we think, kind of brings together the results we've shown so far, where you've got this surprising association between EPS decreasing exclusions and target price optimism. But oh, by the way, they're tweaking their growth forecasts. And oh, by the way, they seem to be tweaking them too much, because it seems like ex post, they're far too optimistic in their growth forecasts. Well, back to the market, they don't get fooled as much, or at least they dial it back in terms of how much they react to these target price revisions associated with EPS decreasing exclusions. Any questions before I kind of carry forward into robustness and contributions and stuff like that? Okay. I will talk briefly about robustness checks. We look at some other measures of target price optimism. I won't go through this, but if you want to have a look at the paper, please do. Yep. Oh, okay. Sorry, I think I hear somebody. Maybe just speak up a little. Thank you.
Hello?
Okay. Hello. Yes.
Thank you so much, dear doctor, for about ISIS explained. I have one question in other subjects. How can I build an effective predictive model for risk management in Takaful insurance company, knowing that the dependent variables is profitability of the company, and independent variables are the groups of risk, underwriting risk and market risk and liquidity risk and other risk. So can you help me? How can I build in effective predictive models? of risk management.
Okay. Thank you
And
for your
thank
question.
you so much.
You're welcome. I will admit that this is not my area of expertise. I have not spent much time in insurance and, for that matter, in risk, but I think in any question like that, it likely makes sense to start with any prior literature in the area and look at what has been done. That's not to say it's been done well, but let's assume that there are publications in the area of insurance and risk and profitability, those areas you've mentioned, that it would make sense to start with what has been researched thus far, or perhaps what has been researched in other industries that could be brought into the insurance industry in your suggestion. I think that's all I can say because it's just not my area of expertise, but yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Yeah. Let me continue. So robustness checks, we've done, we did regression analysis on matched samples. We looked at other measures of exclusions. Okay. So as I think I mentioned early up on, our exclude variables tend to be indicator variables. And we say, well, what if we also looked at continuous measures? Or what if we looked at decile rank measures? Because of course there are some extreme values. Alternate fixed effects, we talked about firm fixed effects, we tried a few other things, and we did some paired matching as well. So I've got a couple slides to conclude, and then I want to talk about something just slightly different before we finish off. I've talked about how we see evidence that exclusions are associated with target price optimism. Yes?
I was just wondering, did all the robustness tests work out?
Okay, I think the one that stood out, which we just chatted about, was when we bring in firm fixed effects, the results do get weaker. No, I wouldn't say they don't work. There's still some evidence, but it's, you know, less significant in the case of firm fixed effects, but we're not surprised by that. The others, in fact, if anything, I would say the continuous and the decile rank actually are quite strong. And another way to look at this, you know, of course, continuous measure is different from an indicator, but we've done quite a bit of robustness, and the results really do seem to hold up, is our sense. But again, we haven't done Fama Macbeth, so that's something we have to add to our list, of course.
That won't work, yeah. I was just wondering too, a lot of papers nowadays, they try to assess what they call the economic significance.
Yes.
Did you try to do that? I'm not a believer in it. I'm just curious how you think about that particular problem, because the journals nowadays have become very big on that.
Yeah.
And that's sort of a little bit what's lurking in the background here. People might ask the question, are you looking at something which is of compelling economic significance?
Mm-hmm.
I think people would raise that issue with you. I'm not sufficiently close to it, but it doesn't sound very compelling in terms of some underlying story.
Okay.
But I haven't read the paper, and that might be a sign of ignorance. But anyhow, as a matter of feedback, that problem might be lurking in the background, and I suspect it may surface, you know, when you get feedback.
Sure. Okay, so you'll be happy to know that if you do get a chance to read the paper, we do mention economic significance. I can point to it a little bit here, okay? And I'm a believer in economic significance, believe me. I once worked in the real world, and I think we need to try and, you know, communicate in that way if we can. What I will say is that, and this is the way we write it in the front end, if you think of a $100 stock with a typical target price around 112, a target price with exclusions would be around 113. I'm saying around because we do this in a few different ways, okay? So is there an economic magnitude? Yes. I wouldn't want it to be too big. I mean, exclusions can't be the only reason, but the only explanation for optimism in target prices. To go from, you know, 12% to 13% return seems big enough to me, but I mean, that's always a difficult thing to judge. There is economic magnitude, and that's the way we dealt with it. You can kind of see that in a regression analysis that says, okay, there's an extra 2% projected return, 1.8% projected return in an implied return when there's an exclusion.
Yeah, another thing you could try to do would be used to use, so would help to appreciate the tables run as standardized regression models.
Mm-hmm.
So then people such as myself could immediately make the judgment if the load factors or the estimated coefficient are of any material magnitude.
So,
yeah.
Okay, if you don't mind, the exclude variable is an indicator variable, so we can't really standardize that.
No, that one is a little bit harder, but all the control variables.
The control variables, okay.
Yes,
okay.
I think you can do that too, but that's a fair question.
Yeah.
But in general, I think in general, as a matter of feedback, is that what one wants to see is that there's a very compelling data support for the basic hypothesis. And when you run some of these things with 400,000 observations, many authors have a difficult time. If we care about finding out what's going on, we have a difficult time paying attention to t-statistics or the number of stars when you have 400,000. Of course you're going to get stars.
Yep, point taken. I mean, we do have match samples as well as regressions, and match samples are much more.
Match samples just raises a different problem because that one should then be non-parametric.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, you can take subsamples and just split everything into 10 subsamples. For each and every subsample, just look at the difference and see if it's recurring across the 10 samples. In other words, it's just a question of making things difficult for yourself to reject the null, unless it is really in place. And your match sample doesn't do that at all, because it doesn't deal with the confounding issues.
Okay, point taken. Thank you. I've talked about what we believe we find and what we believe we can conclude, which is that exclusions, either EPS increasing and decreasing, are associated with more optimistic target prices, and that this is related to analyst discretion in the sense when managers are making non-GAAP disclosures, that there's less of this association, and that in the toolbox kind of prediction or space that we're talking about, that growth estimates and valuation multiples are also tinkered with almost in coordination with the use of exclusions to result in these higher target prices. We talked a little bit about market reaction and the way the market reacts or reacts more or less depending on whether the exclusions are EPS increasing or decreasing. And therefore we believe that we contribute to both the non-GAAP and the target price literature with, we say new evidence, but something that hasn't been looked at before in the sense of something that might impact target prices and their errors and their optimism and really their informativeness for valuation purposes. So we think our findings have sort of information for a number of different groups out there in the market. I want to finish with that, and if you don't mind, I want to just take one moment of your time to talk about FARS. Okay, what I'm going to do is, see if I can find it. Oh, here it is. Just remind you that you are welcome to join the American Accounting Association. I'm the incoming president of the Financial Accounting and Reporting section of AAA. Okay, if you look at AAA, it's got lots of different sections. You're not all financial accounting researchers. Perhaps some of you are because you're listening to a financial accounting paper, but there's lots of different great groups, and a great way for an audience such as yourselves, international researchers, many of you, some of you earlier in your career, some of you of course later in your careers, but a really great place to find and to connect with other people and to attend meetings that tend to be quite fun and in some cases quite informative in terms of the type of presentations and the type of workshops and papers that are presented. So I just wanted to sort of end with that, and I think I'll just say thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I know some of you are late into the evening, and I really appreciate your time and all your comments. We will certainly take them into account.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Stephannie Larocque, for your contribution and your effort. It's really a very interesting presentation. I think that you have done very well with answering a lot of questions there, dear Professor Stephannie Larocque. So thank you very much. Indeed, so all that remains for me to say is thank you everyone that joined us, and I thank you very much for taking the time out to present to us today, dear Professor Stephannie Larocque. It's been really appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
Thank you.